And welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we watch the people who are watching the players, watching the people who are playing RC Houston, who are watching the people watching the metagame. Something like that. So today we are going to be taking a look, as we always do, with the Modern, Standard, and Pioneer challenge results over the weekend. There is also a paper tournament that we're going to get to, which, by the way, I attended that paper tournament. So we'll talk about that when we get to the Modern section, and we'll take a look and see what the metagame looks like, comparing it from last week to this week, and then at the very end of each segment, we will find some very, very spicy deck lists from the top 32s of the challenges. But before we continue, a quick word from today's sponsor, CoolStuffInc.com. This video is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com. Be sure to use promo code DOOM at checkout if you guys want to buy any singles, sealed sleeves, or deck boxes. Cool Stuff Inc. They got cool stuff, and they got it in stock. And with that out of the way, let us begin, as we always do, with Modern. And as you can see on the screen in front of you, Modern is looking pretty good. Metagame is extremely healthy. As far as the metagame from the paper tournament, which, by the way, regional championship in Houston, I don't believe there was any deck that eclipsed 13% of the metagame. I believe it was Blink. They kind of lumped Blink variants together. I think it was around 13. Amulet was like 12.5, and then from there, it kind of tapered off from there. And that's basically what we see here. I will say, as far as online versus paper is concerned, significantly lower representation of Amulet compared to what we saw in RC Houston. That paper tournament regional championship was won by Jeskai Blink in the hands of Vinny Fino. Shout out to Vinny, my goat. And the other challenges online, 3 Energy, 2 Ruby Storm, 1 Dimir Murktide, and 1 Esper Blink. As far as the numbers go, you look, Boros Energy down a little bit from last week, from 13.8 to 11.7. You know, as far as Boros Energy is concerned, I think it's continuously on the decline from week to week. I mean, it certainly fluctuates. Like, there was one week it was 10, then it was 13, now it's 11, I guess pushing on 12. And it's weird because Boros actually had a decent weekend in Houston. I believe there was one Boros deck in the top 8, and I think there might have been 3 more in the top 32, at least 2 more. And which is surprising to me, because I kind of figured that if the most popular decks going into the weekend were Amulet Titan, Belcher, which, by the way, has just completely fallen off into essentially non-existent, which is very, very strange to me after winning the Pro Tour. So, and then Affinity as well, which I think historically Affinity is not a very good matchup for Boros. Domain Zoo can be pretty tough if they have Leyline Scion. Really, the only good matchup as far as the top 5 or 6 decks are concerned really is like, maybe is it Prowess? But after that, it's tough sledding here for Boros. Speaking of Affinity, that is the deck that I played. It was, I believe, the deck with the 2nd or 3rd highest win rate in RC Houston. So I guess I picked the right deck. And then, speaking of RC Houston, I talked a lot about it on stream yesterday, kind of did like a RC debrief. I'm going to be uploading that. Depending on when this goes out, I'm not positive if we're going to upload it Tuesday or Thursday. So the debrief might already be up on YouTube, and if it's not, it'll be tomorrow's video. So be on the lookout for that if it's not already up. Brood Scale, 5.1, down a little bit from last week from 7.1. As I mentioned, Amulet Titan 4.9 up to 5.9. It was a lot higher than that in Houston. So that was actually 2 of my losses in the weekend was Amulet. And then from there, not a ton else to say. I will mention huge uptick in Jeskai Blink, which I think makes sense because the deck was doing extremely well over the weekend in Houston. And I think people saw the results from RC Houston and played it in the Sunday challenges, so it had a higher representation in the Sunday challenges, and then obviously ended up winning the RC event as well. So that's what we are looking like for the metagame. Pretty standard stuff, nothing too crazy. But speaking of crazy, let's see if we can find some spicy deck lists. And we are going to begin the spicy deck list section with Affinity, which inherently is not necessarily spicy. But this specific version, piloted by Chahi to a 3rd place finish, definitely is. So you'll notice a couple of different things about this deck list. First and foremost, 4 copies of Weapons Manufacturing. Typically, you'll see 2 copies, if any. A lot of times you think you'll see 0. but weapons manufacturing is a powerful card. It's sort of, the way that I look at it is it's kind of like a diet Pinnacle Emissary. Emissary is certainly more powerful because it's 1 mana versus 2 when you're warping it, but weapons manufacturing does have some cool synergies that you can lean into, and boy did Chahi do that. Chahi played 4 copies of Arcbound Ravager in the main deck, which is sack an artifact, put a counter, and then it has modular, which means when Arcbound Ravager dies, you can transfer the counters. So if you combine Ravager with weapons manufacturing, this is a very, very potent sacrifice outlet to be able to put those munitions into the graveyard, and then not only get a bunch of pings off the weapons tokens, but you also get counters in your Ravager. And then the really, really cool thing about this deck list that I love is Rust Harvester. So this is red for a 1/1 with Menace. You can pay 2, tap, exile an artifact from your graveyard, put a counter on it, then it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So if you have a board state with a bunch of weapons and a Ravager, what you can actually do is sacrifice all of your stuff, make the Ravager huge, sack the Ravager to itself, put the counters on the Harvester, and then just dome your opponent for roughly 1 million because you now have a giant Rust Harvester. So I think that aspect is kind of cool. A couple of cranial platings, is playing 4 drum, 4 Thopter, which I think you kind of have to if you're playing this many 2-drops, right? Normally Affinity plays 2 weapons and that's it for 2 mana cards, but this build is piloting the full 10 2-mana cards. So you do kind of need this additional acceleration with the drum. But yeah, other than that, I think it looks pretty sweet. Definitely an interesting take on the Affinity archetype, pairing weapons with Ravager and the cool kind of OTK finish with Rust Harvester. There's the sideboard if you want to take a look, and yeah, really, really sweet looking Affinity deck. Next up here, we have Internet Surfer 09, who piloted this Enchantments deck to a 3rd place finish. I believe Internet Surfer 09, also known as Young Peasy 420 on Twitch, if you want to go check them out. I believe they do lots of live streams. I'm pretty sure they play mostly this deck. And what's really cool about this, initially when I was labeling this on my decklist spreadsheet, I labeled it as Enchantress. And I realized that maybe that's not an appropriate deck name for this, because there's no Enchantresses. Normally you associate Enchantress with stuff like, if you're talking about Legacy, Argothian Enchantress, but compared to Modern, Sithis, the Harvest Hand, and Enchantress's Presence, which allow you to draw cards when you play enchantments. This deck is not necessarily interested in those type of effects. The main goal here is to assemble some number of Greater Oromancy and Sterling Grove, which allows all of your other enchantments to be unable to be targeted. Right? This one gives them Shroud. This one gives them. It's both Shroud. I thought this was Hexproof for some reason. So yeah, both of these give your other enchantment Shroud. So this is ways to protect your combo. And then you have a couple of different combos, both of which involve Solemnity. 9 lives, which says if a source would deal damage, prevent that damage and put a counter on it. And then Unlife, which says when you have 0 or less life, all damage is dealt to you as though it had Infect, so you get poison counters. But Solemnity says that players and permanents can't get counters. So in the instance of Unlife, once you have 0 or less life, you never take any damage because you can't get poison counters. And then with 9 lives, this card can't get Incarnation counters, which means that it never gets to the 9th counter to eventually run out of lives. And funny enough, you might be looking at this deck list and asking to yourself, what is the win condition here? The win condition, I kid you not, is Wheel of Sun and Moon to yourself, and then when you discard a hand size, you put the cards back in the bottom, and their opponent can never kill you because you can't take damage. If they have some sort of card that gets around it, like All is Dust, which gets around the Shroud from Grove and Oromancy, you can never more of those cards. You have Battlefront to find the combo more reliably, same thing with Rumble. And yeah, let me tell you this, you're not going to make any friends at the casual table playing this deck, but I gotta tell you, I played a couple of games with this one. It is pretty potent. So looking at the sideboard here, so again, big shout out to Internet Surfer 09. Thopter Sword is a name that I have not heard in quite some time, and Topher Marsh has got us covered here in 30th place. So for people who haven't seen this combination of cards before, Thopter Foundry and Sword of the Meek, this is the combo. So Thopter Foundry is an artifact that lets you pay 1 mana and sack a non-token artifact to make a 1/1 Thopter with flying, gain a life. Sword of the Meek says whenever 1/1 creature enters the battlefield under your control, you return the sword from the graveyard to the battlefield. So you pay a mana, sack the sword, get a 1/1. 1/1 triggers the sword to come back into play. You then pay 1 mana, sack the sword, make a 1/1, triggers the sword. You get the idea. Now, the way to go infinite is with Urza Lord High Artificer, because every time you're going through the loop, you can actually use the Urza to tap the sword for mana. And then when the sword comes back, it's untapped. So this allows you to go infinite, which lets you make infinite untapped Thopters, then you can make infinite blue mana, basically draw your entire deck. Now, from there, there's no like Fireball or Walking Ballista or Thassa's Oracle. There's no way to like actually win the game that turn. But, I mean, you have infinite 1/1 flyers. You can draw some interaction to make sure that you don't die that turn, and should be good enough. We have the kind of dual threat of acceleration with Amber and Opal here because we are playing enough Legends for Tamiyo and for Emery. Couple of Teferis. I really want to highlight Malevolent Rumble as a cool addition to this deck because it finds all of your combo pieces. It can put Sword in the graveyard, it can find Thopter Foundry, it can even find Urza if the games aren't about the combo, like if for some reason you can't assemble the combo and you just need to get some more stuff. It fills the graveyard for Woodland, it finds Urza Saga, it just does everything in this deck. Can't say enough good things about Rumble. But yeah, really cool looking deck list here from Topher Marsh. Again, I really haven't seen any Thopter Sword decks floating around in a while, so it's good to see them every once and again. And last but not least, from Bach in 26th place. So you may have seen mono black Necro Dominance decks before. This is a card that allows you to pay a bunch of life and draw a bunch of cards. You pair that with Soul Spike, a free spell that lets you deal 4 and gain 4. You can pair it with March of Wretched Sorrow. So in your end step, if you have a black mana untapped, you can use, say you Necro for 17 or whatever, you can pitch all of the extra cards that you don't need to March, gain all that life back, and then go again next turn. Now, typically, the win conditions with this deck is just Soul Spike them out, attack with Shieldred, stuff like that. We are actually playing in this deck list Veto Thorn of the Dusk Rose. So this is a 3-mana 1/3 that says whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. And I don't know if you catch my drift here, but when you March of Wretched Sorrow and pitch 10 cards from your hand, you're effectively dealing 20 damage to a creature or planeswalker and gaining X life. And when you're gaining 20 life with Veto, your opponent loses the game. So that is, I'm not going to say the main win condition, but it is a win condition. Shout out to Sorin as well. Sorin's kind of cool in this deck because if you can pair it with either Wretched Sorrow or Soul Spike, you can flip the Sorin, and in a same sort of similar vein, you march for a bunch, flip the Sorin, maybe the backside of Sorin can kill them because it deals damage equal to the amount of life you gain this turn. So that's kind of cool. And then the other interesting thing that I wanted to highlight here is Moxhammer combined with stuff like Cecil and Sorin, because that allows, specifically with Cecil, if you go turn 1 Cecil, turn 2 Moxhammer, that lets you Necro on turn 2. So that was kind of cool as well. So there you go. There's a little update to Mono Black Necro. Now that we have taken a look at Modern, let's go ahead and switch over to Pioneer. So here's Pioneer as basically not going to say the exact same, but there's some differences. Mono Red Mice still at the top of the heap at 18.1%, essentially the same as last week. Demons down a little bit from 16 to 10. Azorius Controlled down slightly from 13 to 10. And then big uptick here in Phoenix from 8.9 to 13.1. So about slightly over 4% increase in percentage-wise. Mono Black up as well from 5.7 to 8.1. 5-color Legends basically non-existent here. I don't even know where it is on the... I don't know if there were anybody who played 5-color Legends here, so non-existent. There might have been one or two, but it's probably up here somewhere. Martyr Greasefang, roughly the same. Here's a big one. Orzhov Monument from 3.1 to 7.5%. Gruul Prowess as well, 2.1 to 8.1. Actually taking down one of the challenges with Gruul Prowess. So those are some pretty big movers, right? Gruul Prowess, Orzhov Monument, if you're interested in playing either of those decks. They seem to be on the up and up here. Nothing else too crazy. There was some downticks in Boros Hammer and Dimir Demons, but other than that, the noticeable changes here are Phoenix, Orzhov Monument, and Gruul Prowess. I think those are the three biggest changes here. But other than that, 5 challenges, 2 won by Phoenix, 2 won by Mono Red, 1 by 1 by Gruul Prowess. So now that we have taken a look at the metagame, let's see if we can find some nice deck lists. Does anybody remember a little card called Tree of Perdition? The kids these days, they put their VVs under their cauldrons. They don't know how we had it back in the day. And by back in the day, I mean October of 2024. Shout out to Spock Vita Loca, who participated in a challenge this weekend and got 24th place with what I can only describe as essentially the exact same deck list that won the last regional championship, that was Pioneer, in the hands of Corey Lack in Rakdos Tree. There's a couple of differences. I don't think Corey had the Unholy Annexes, but it is very, very similar. And I just wanted to highlight this as a throwback, and I wanted to showcase this as this is how we used to have it. This is what WotC has taken away from us with Pioneer not being supported as a competitive format. This deck was nowhere to be seen in the months leading up to the RC, and then Corey just said, hold my beer, and crushed everybody at the tournament with this deck that basically nobody had seen before. We're never going to get that again. You know, I just wanted to give a shout out to the tree. But yeah, for people who haven't seen it, you put the tree under the cauldron. That gives any creature the ability of the tree, which allows you to exchange target opponent's life total with Tree of Perdition's toughness. So if you have a 1/1 creature in play and you put a counter on it with Cauldron, you now have a 2/2, and your opponent, say, is at 20 life. You tap your 2/2, now they go to 2, and you have a 2/20. And then with Thrillseeker specifically, you can just sack the Thrillseeker to then deal them the last 2 damage. So it kind of is just an OTK setup with Thrillseeker. But yeah, bunch of like Rakdos interaction, Blood Tithe Fable, Fear of Missing Out, good cards, couple annexes to pair with the Mutavaults. But yeah, I just wanted to say I missed the tree. Next up, we have DB Guide Twin with this Dimir, I guess, mid-range deck. A lot of people have been trying this in Standard with Riddler and not Essence Flux, but the Splash Portal, which is the sorcery version of this that we have in Standard. And basically the idea is you warp the Riddler and then you pay 1 mana to flicker the Riddler, similar to what people do in Modern with Ephemerate. And you kind of just use that as your main threat engine in a deck that just has a bunch of good blue and black cards. Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Go for the Throat, Duress is very cheap interaction. Cantrips to find your combo, quote unquote, with Consider. Graveyard Trespasser and Shredder. Shredder particularly good because we have a pile of 1 mana cards like 4 Consider, 4 Flux, 4 Push, 4 Thoughtseize. So you're going to be triggering Shredder very, very often. And then 4 whole copies of Shieldred. I think this is definitely a statement, but one that I think makes a lot of sense because Shieldred very powerful with Riddler. Riddler is going to be drawing a bunch of extra cards. Because you have a bunch of 1 mana cards, you can also empty your hand faster for the Riddler. And then if you're drawing 2 off a Riddler with a Shieldred in play, my goodness. I don't even want to think about what could have happened if we had both of these cards in Standard at the same time. That would have been kind of wild. So yeah, really cool looking deck list here from DB Guide Twin. Kind of a slightly different take on the more, you could maybe akin this to Rakdos, where it's like 2 drops, interaction, couple of Shieldreds, but kind of slightly different take on the mid-range shells in Pioneer. 7th Prophet is up next here in 26th place. You may remember that username from last week's episode, or was it 2 weeks ago? I think it might have been 2 weeks ago, with the Pioneer Merfolk deck. And they don't stop the hits here in Pioneer. So this is an Eldrazi deck, right? Where it is ostensibly a ramp deck, where you have stuff like Arboreal Grazer and Glimpse the Core as your main ramp engines alongside Overlord of the Hauntwoods to get a bunch of mana. You have the cards that, you have some stuff that mills cards into the graveyard, like Grapple with the Past and Cash Grab, which can put stuff into your graveyard and find you your threats. Putting stuff into the graveyard, very good with Emrakul. Also, putting stuff into the graveyard happens to be good with Ice Till, because if you mill over lands off Cash Grab, you can then play those lands off of the Ice Till, and then Ice Till also mills more cards to set up the Emrakul. You can also mill over World Breaker, and then if you get enough mana, you can sacrifice lands to return the Breaker and then recast it. Breaker also pretty good with Ice-Till because the lands that you're sacking off Breaker can just be replayed with Ice-Till. You have Lumra here, so you can do a bunch of self-milling with Ice-Till, Grapple, and Cash Grab, and then cast Lumra to return all of those lands that you milled over from the graveyard right into the battlefield. Some Kozilek's Return, also another good card that you can mill over with Cash Grab and Ice-Till, and then cast your big Eldrazi, flashback K-Return, deal a bunch of damage. A lot of cool stuff going on here. Definitely the downside to playing this deck in Pioneer compared to Modern is you don't have Eldrazi Temple, so you gotta get a little bit fancy with your 2-mana lands, but I do think this deck looks pretty fun, and I want to give this one a try myself. Okay, I gotta be honest with you, I ran out of interesting deck lists when I was looking at the challenges, so I had to go into the league dump here to find a Pioneer version of the Kavero Mindbitten Reanimator deck. So, as in Standard, as people have been playing, they're playing Kavero with Bringer. So if you Kavero with a Bringer in the graveyard, it enters as a copy of Bringer, which notes that it was cast because you cast it from your hand, and then you get the whole living end effect. And so basically, there's a bunch of self-mill with like Overlord of the Baelmerk, Awaken the Honored Dead, Satyr Wayfinder, Oracle of Tragedy, things like that. The main differences here between Standard and Pioneer is, well, Thoughtseize, that card I've heard is very good, and then you get this card called Sidisi's Faithful. This is kind of a weird one, but it says it's a 1-mana 0/4 with Exploit, and when it enters, you can sack a creature. So when it enters, if you exploit, return target creature to its owner's hand. Now this is cool for a couple of reasons. One, you can return, say they like have something in the graveyard that they get back after the living end effect from Bringer. You can just sack the Faithful itself, bounce their creature, and then they have nothing. You have all this huge battlefield. You can also return Kavero Mindbitten to your hand, which is now a copy of Bringer, in case you need to go again the next turn, right? So you can, that's kind of cool as well. So some interesting things then and cool stuff you can do with Sidisi's Faithful. There's a Hate Weaver in this deck list, and I cannot figure out why for the life of me. If you guys know, let me know in the comments. Apparently we're trying to give blue or red creatures +1/+0. Not really sure why. Shigeki Thassa's Oracle is kind of cool. If you go a little bit too far in the milling, you can put an Oracle into play. But yeah, that is the deck list here for iHuman, and that is going to wrap up Pioneer. Let's go ahead and finish things off with Standard. Here's the Standard metagame. Let's find some deck lists. Okay, now, we meme on the Standard metagame a lot, but I will say, big shout out to Oaf McNamara, Scott, aka Scott McNamara, who won a challenge this past weekend with a very, very different take on blue-white. You're probably not used to seeing some of these cards. Well, maybe you are. So the core is Novice and Spyglass, so each of these make an additional permanent when they come into play. Very powerful with stuff like Warden of the Inner Sky and Regal Bunnicorn. Bunnicorn gets big, Warden also gets big. This sort of core gives you a pretty good setup for Cosmogrand because you have a bunch of 1-mana cards that pair with Cosmogrand. And all of these cards work pretty well with Halia because Halia says whenever an artifact or creature enters, gain a life. These make two things enter the battlefield for Halia. And Halia says end step, if you've gained 3 or more life, draw a card. So if you pair Halia with Spyglass or Inspector, you can immediately draw a card that turn. And then, as is basically every blue deck in every format in Magic is doing, if you just add Quantum Riddler to your deck, it just makes it 10 times better. So 4x Quantum Riddlers here. There's not really a ton of synergy with the Riddlers. Like, I mean, I guess you can use it as a cheap-ish body to tap to Warden. You can... I mean, it's a permanent for Bunnicorn. It's a trigger for Halia. You can copy it with Mockingbird. Well, I mean, that would be 5 mana. But there's no, like, Splash Portal or way to flicker it or anything like that. It's just 2 mana for a body that draws a card. And then once you get to 5 mana, your hand is presumably emptied at that point. So it is a good way to kind of refuel and gas back up, which I like. Sheltered, Seamrip, and Floodmoth, 3 of each for the removal spells. Couldn't decide which one was the best. And then as far as the sideboard, here is 4 Detect Intrusion, aka Spidey Sense. So yeah, I will say, Standard, we kind of meme on it a lot, but this deck list does look pretty sick. Next up here from Frodo in 8th place. This is a Boros Burn deck that I've seen picking up in popularity a little bit over the past couple of weeks, and I haven't had the opportunity to highlight it yet, so I wanted to show it today. Essentially, it's playing the best red creatures with Hired Claw and Emberheart Challenger and Screaming Nemesis, but it's pairing that with Cosmogran Zenith and Gloria as well. Gloria is a card you may not have seen before. This is the Aranya from the Spider-Man set. It's a 3/3 for 3. Whenever you attack, put a counter on an attacking creature, and whenever a modified creature deals damage to a player, exile the top card of your library, and you can play that card this turn. So importantly, Gloria says whenever you attack, not attack with Gloria. So your Challenger and Claw can put a counter on themselves. And then you're pairing that with Zenith because we have a lot of 1-mana cards with the Claws, the Burst Lightnings. Not that many 1-mana cards, but enough. And then a bunch of 2-mana burn spells, Helix, Boros Charm, playing a Most Helpful Weaver, which curves very nicely into Gloria because it gives you a 2/1 and then you put a counter on it. So that curves kind of nice into Gloria. Some Sheltered by Ghosts for removal. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the deck list. Take a look at the sideboard here for posterity's sake. 4 Razorkin Needlehead. Got to get those VV players. So yeah, this is kind of what the Boros decks have been looking like over the past couple of weeks. And I just wanted to show you guys, just in case you want to give the Boros deck a try. And last but not least here from Genkinman 2 in 29th place. I actually found this deck. Was it the showcase was last? I think it was the showcase was last week. This person actually had a top 16 finish in the showcase, but there were other decks that I wanted to show that particular week, so we didn't get to this one. But this deck is kind of cool, where you have a bunch of blue-black interaction. Ostensibly at its core, this deck is a blue-black control deck. You have Consult for card draw, Exhale for counter spells, a bunch of removal, and shoot, Bitter Triumph, Deadly Cover-Up for sweepers, Nowhere to Run, etc., etc. Caustic Exhale as well. So, at its core, blue-black control. Nothing crazy going on there. But the win condition is where it gets kind of spicy. So, I would like to call this deck Splinter Twin. And your Splinter Twin is Greed's Gambit, which is a 4-mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, gain 6 life, and make 3 2/1 bad creature tokens with flying. Best card of all time. Oh wait, there's more. At the beginning of your end step, you discard a card, lose 2 life, and sack a creature. And then when it leaves the battlefield, you discard 3, lose 6, and sack 3 creatures. What if I told you that you could take this card and resolve the ETB trigger, do all the good things, and then give it to your opponent, which is what Coveted Falcon does. So this is a 1/4 flyer for 3. You can disguise it, which means you can pay it as face down as a 2/2 creature for 3 colorless. You can flip it up for 2 mana, and when it's turn face up, target opponent gains control of any number of target permanents you control. Draw a card for each one they gained control of this way. So the idea is you play the Gambit, you get all the good things off of it, and then you pay 2, flip the Falcon, give them the Gambit. You have just an overwhelming advantage at that point. You're up 3 cards, 6 life, and 3 creatures in the battlefield, and then on their end step, they have to discard a card, lose 2, and sack a creature. Pretty sick as the win condition here in this blue-black control deck. I'm not normally a big fan of control, but I gotta say, Gambit Falcon, that might get me to play a control deck. And that, my friends, is going to do it for another episode of Watching the Meta. I thank you guys, as always, for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this week's video. Let me know in the comment section down below, what was your favorite deck list that we covered in today's video? And I'll see you guys next week. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, adios.